they seem very, very adamant that we will never apply these. As somebody in the floor debate suggested, we cannot uninvent nuclear weapons, and once we have stopped their manufacture altogether, we cannot go back. In the future, Britain may realise that actually, no, Iran is a threat, and we are directly under threat from them. But, oh no, we've stopped the manufacture of all our nuclear weapons, and we have no protection. Secondly, somebody suggested that the economic viability of nuclear weapons may not be valid. Well, we suggest that while we still require them, while we need them, however long that may be, isn't it good to highlight that they do actually provide, that they do serve a role in Britain, not just as a deterrent, but as a huge employer in West Berkshire? Not saying that they help the economy, we're not saying that they help, we're not saying that we will need them forever, but we are saying that they help the economy, as opposed to suggesting that by scrapping Trident we would instantly save ourselves billions of pounds. That's not right to suggest. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we would suggest that nuclear weapons are still very much relevant in this day and age. We feel that the proposition has really missed the point that terrorist groups are linked to countries and that they, in effect, resource those terrorist groups, and if the threat was big enough and we could justify that threat with a good response, such as nuclear attack, then we have all signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, all 189 states have signed this, that they would respond with nuclear attack. Finally, to just sum up our arguments once more, unilateral disarmament is irresponsible, the nuclear weapon industry is vital to our economy, and unilaterally disarming would pose a risk to the security of our citizens. Thank you.
Summary from Haberdashers as Boys School is Edwards of Switzer.
Just bring a mess.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to talk to you about today is, first of all, whether our proposition is better for the interest of the United Kingdom, in terms of our security and a few other interests. And then second of all, I want to look at a more global issue of world disarmament and stability within the world, and whether it's also good for that. But before I do so, I'll just run through some of the points that we got from the floor separately, so that I sort of dignify them with a proper response. In response to the issue of Arnie, we think that Arnie plays fair. Arnie doesn't kick his opponents in the balls, so to speak. And we think that the United Kingdom needs to play fair as well. We've made these agreements. Arnie is a man of his word. I'm a man of my word. Let's abolish nuclear weapons. We had an interesting point that the only thing we gained from abolishing nuclear weapons was sort of some respect, because we're not that really important. But we think that missed a lot of the analysis that Hassan gave you, that actually it gives an impetus to global disarmament if it can be seen that one of the major 5 powers that had them in the beginning to disarm can disarm unilaterally. We heard that Russia and China are snubbing us. Just because they're snubbing us doesn't mean that we're returning to a Cold War situation. Like, it's nothing like the Cold War. You know, they're very friendly to us in a lot of ways, blah, blah, blah. We don't think it's the same situation. And finally, we had this point about Israel. And we said, you know, if they knew that Tehran was going to be nuked, then they probably wouldn't do it. You're right, they probably wouldn't do it. But that is just never going to happen. Israel, as hawkish as they are, could never justify nuking Tehran for the actions of Hezbollah. So I'm going to move on to my case now. And the first issue was about our own interests and our own security. Because I got up here right at the beginning and I said, look, they're not a very good defence, because this logic of deterrence that worked in the Cold War doesn't work anymore. I talked about non-state actors, I talked about people not believing that we're going to use them, and I talked about leaders of rogue states being nuts, and therefore the logic of deterrence not working. Now, the kind of responses we got to this were, first of all, in the first speech we heard about jobs. And we just don't think that jobs, 6,500 jobs, is a legitimate reason to have weapons that are capable of committing mass genocide. And they also don't in any way deal with any of our other arguments. So we thought 6,500 jobs wasn't really the point. Then we also talked about, I also talked about why they're not part of our military, and why in terms of our own interest, in terms of what we want to do with our military, it is criminal that people are dying because we're not prioritising resources correctly, and we didn't get any response to that. And then what we basically heard, the only other thing we heard from opposition was, well, we need to protect our own people. And towards the end of their speeches, they started suggesting that if terrorists took over a nuke in Pakistan, that our nukes would be a deterrent against them. No, they wouldn't. If terrorists took control of, and made dirty bombs, we could never justify nuking Pakistan for the action of a non-state actor. You don't seem to understand this. It is completely unreasonable to suggest that we're going to wipe out 2 million people because one organisation takes some nuclear material. You gave the example of Afghanistan. Afghanistan falls on our side. We didn't nuke Afghanistan. That's the whole point, because we couldn't justify that. Instead, we had to go in with conventional force, which you don't want to give money to, because you want to keep nuclear weapons, which were completely useless in the case of Afghanistan. So your whole point there seems to be flawed. And then second of all, the issue of world disarmament, because Hassan gave you a lot of analysis into the NPT. And they said, oh, well, you know, the NPT is actually been working. We say, yes, it's been working to some extent. But what we're saying is, let's look to the future. Let's look when in another 20, 30 years, people see that we still haven't disarmed, that we haven't lived up to those promises we made when we swore that at the earliest date possible, we were going to disarm. This idea that it's responsible, it has to be responsible. Why does responsible mean multilateral? We think it's responsible unilaterally to give up our nuclear weapons. Why not? We got no analysis at any point as to why we shouldn't give up these things. We think it's responsible to live up to our promises, and that's why we stand proudly in proposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very entertaining second debate. We thank all our debaters from the school, Friars, and from Hamadash's Boys School for their debate. So thank you very much. We now have a short break while the judges go and deliberate and come to some conclusions. And whilst they're doing that, there are some refreshments, and Jack's going to show us exactly where we're going. So give a break for about 15 minutes.
Hi guys.
Yeah, man.
Well, boys, we're the minority. We felt threatened.
Well done. Congratulations for this. To get through to